I studied under E.S. Varadaraja Iyer, also in Anomaly, and with him, one of the most interesting bits of what became my principal interest in Tamil, that's what we call Sangha Ilakyam, the early stratum of Tamil court or bardic poetry. Which eventually somehow I managed to bring out a book on. Mm-hmm. And the text in that one that I studied with Varadaraja Iyer was Paripado. Now, Paripado was particularly interesting because while it belongs to the 8 anthologies, the Otatoge, it also includes devotional poetry, willy-nilly. Both in praise of Tirumal, that is Lord Vishnu, and also Murugan, Subramanian. Yes. And so I was very interested in those. I studied with Varadaraja Iyer, as I say. I must get on. I'm sorry, it's a long story. Wendy and I made a brief tour of South India by public transport in 1954, March. We had to be a bit careful because by then she was pregnant and we were warned about all sorts of things that she mustn't do. And she went ahead and did them anyway. And eventually, in June 1954, the gentleman who has been such a help in setting all this up, that is Master James, was born in what was then Madras. And recently in the census, it was quite amusing because of all our children, he was the only one who could legitimately put that he wasn't born in this country. What he couldn't remember, of course, because he was only 3 or 4 months old when we came back, was the date that he entered England. But I was able to supply that, wasn't I, James? He's here, you see, naturally. Now, I continued studying. It was very fortunate. The British Council had a flat that they wanted looking after for some months for one of their officers, and it suited us to be there because it meant that Wendy could give birth in the flat. She didn't need to go. She took one look at the hospital. She said, "This is like a barracks. I'm not going to have my child here." And so she had James at home. We had a very good doctor called Dr. Madanayagam, and we had a live-in nurse, Parvati, for a week after James was born. And so it all passed off. So there he was, a new member of, with both Indian and British nationality at that time. That's another story. And I, meanwhile, studied at the Music Academy under Mudikonda Venkataram Iyer, the Madras Music Academy. I learnt a number of pieces from him. He was one of the best teachers. At Anomaly, of course, my principal teacher was Chitto Subramaniam Pillai, who was again a well-known artist also, but I think of him mainly as a teacher. Also close to the Music Academy, I should have mentioned him before, in 2 or 3 contexts, was Professor Raghavan. Raghavan was Professor of Sanskrit in Madras University, and he was a leading light in the Music Academy. And it was through him, really, that I got invited to the Music Academy conference that year, the same year. Right. I've got a note here that when Modi Kondan learnt that the last month in India we were going to spend in Nepator with Anna and the family, he was horrified. He said, how can you go to a village with a small baby? I said, well, people have been living in villages with small babies for centuries. You know, I couldn't see what the problem was. And in fact, of course, they spoilt James as a baby. I mean, he only had to open his mouth to start crying, and somebody would rush to Wendy, who might be shaking, had to be shaken awake. Poor dear, she was asleep. Baby crying, you know. And so Wendy had to attend to dear James. So he was very well looked after in Nepator, indeed. And in due course, we came back to England by sea, stopping at, of course, Port Said, Naples, Marseille, and Gibraltar. Naples, of course, I couldn't bear not to go ashore. We went to Pompeii. So I have photos to this day of Wendy or me lugging James round Pompeii as a baby. So whether he's been there since, I can't remember. But he certainly went there then. And we came back and I resumed my studies at SOAS, remembering that this visit had been a postgraduate studentship for a year, and it was obligatory to spend a year in India. So willy-nilly, Wendy got her year in India at that time. And in due course, I was appointed autumn, not that year that we got back, it was 1955, initially as lecturer in Tamil.
Yes.
And this somehow or other by osmosis got added to. Arnold Barker, whom I've mentioned already, died in 1963, and I temporarily took on music until a new appointee, which was one lady, Rajeshwari Dutta.
Yes.
She was appointed a lecturer in music. She unfortunately passed away rather earlier, and so I was again appointed music and got to teach music. But another thing came back to roost, as it were, which I'm coming to, and that was Indian art history and archaeology.
Yes, I was going to ask you.
At the same time as I did Telugu, I had studied archaeology under Sir Mortimer Wheeler, who was a figure to conjure with in the archaeological world. And he ran something called Swan Tours, Swan Hellenic. These were upmarket land tours of India, the Middle East. They used to go to Iran and the old, the Hellenic, which was their bread and butter, Hellenic and the Nile cruises. So they started land tours to India, and through a dear friend in the Indology department at SOAS, John Burton Page, he was already lecturing for Swans, and he suggested my name, and I eventually got onto Swans' lists as a guest lecturer and started going regularly from 1973 onwards, right up to when they sold their land tour option and I think rather ill-advisedly went into the cruising market. Well, the cruising market, as you would, I'm sure, appreciate, didn't cater for, shall we say, heroic and valorous land tours over Mysore roads, anybody's roads, various discomforts in hotels, all that sort of thing. This didn't suit the cruising mentality at all. But it enabled me, first of all, and then Wendy, to get thoroughly acquainted with many sites, so that, almost learn them by heart. Places like Ellora, Ajanta, Mahabalipuram, which was a particular interest to me because of the Pallavas, and the fact that to this day I still think that there is no Indian calligraphy or script to match Mahendravarman's Pallava inscriptions in the rock fort temple in Trichy on the pillars.
They're beautiful, absolutely.
It's the most beautiful script, and as you may possibly know, I've adopted Swasti Sri from that for many years. One of my grandchildren even carved me a chair, which is in our garden, and it's got Swasti Sri at the back of it. He carved it. He copied out the logo, so it's become like a logo in a way. That's that one.
John, speaking of your garden, do you want to mention the Burmese pagoda and how it ended up there?
Oh, yes, the pagoda. Well, that was actually, as I discovered, the 1924 Wembley exhibition, Empire exhibition, in the old Wembley Stadium, which actually I think was built for the purpose. It's now gone, of course. And the Burma Oil Company, on their stand, which was the pagoda, had their oil products. I've got a photograph taken at the time, which I managed to copy, of the pagoda in all its glory. Well, I'm afraid a lot of it's been blown away. When the house in which the garden in which it was, they were going to build flats there, I said, can I buy it? Oh, you can have it, for goodness sake, take it away. So we did. We took it down piece by piece and brought it to our garden and re-erected it, in which children had a very active part. They were still children then, several of them. And because we finally had 6. And that, of course, brings me to the next bit.
Wait, before we leave the pagoda, what about the bells from the Bangkok market, which, if the wind was blowing in the right direction, would sound the opening notes of the Sibelius Fifth Symphony? Is that not the case?
Oh, yes, that's right. I've forgotten about that. Well, those are the bells.
Yes.
Bells that I bought in Thailand to tune with it. Dear David, I had forgotten that story completely.
You can see it made a huge impression upon me.
That one. That's it. And so I chose the bells when I was in Thailand on a swan tour for just that purpose, indeed. Well, actually, I'm afraid my late dear father didn't like these bells chiming at night because he said they kept him awake, so I had to take them down. But that's I'm not sure where they are now.
I see.
Anyway, apart from the swan tours and the fact that I was able to make journeys to various rather strange places for various reasons, having this keen interest in botany, which was the other thing, the guiding force, we decided on a land tour to India in 1969. We took, my whole purpose, of course, behind it was to make sure that all our children who hadn't been already born there got to India. So we took our 3 youngest at the time, Alastair, who was 11, Neela, who was 9, and Saras, who was 6, to India. And in the case, of course, of both Neela and Saras, they met their namesakes there, namely Anna's daughters. And I've got photographs of the namesakes of both with them. One in Tanjavur and the other one probably in Delhi, Neela. So that happened. We covered 21,500 miles in 4.5 months. We got there safely, there and back, with lots of adventures, which I wouldn't bore you with. We never went through Israel, I'm afraid. We went the northern route, that is through Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan. And when my daughters, some people hear that they've been to Afghanistan twice, in view of more recent history, that is there and back, they can't believe that we went to Afghanistan of all places, because since then. Pakistan and India. And we got eventually down to Nepator. I remember we arrived about 8 o'clock at night. And some unfortunate things, David, which I can't help passing on. Anna's youngest son, Babu Jagadishan, out of the darkness, when he opened the compound gate for our car and ourselves to go in, do you know what rang out in the darkness in a South Indian village at night? Hello, hello, hello. That's what it was. And I'm afraid I had taught it. So you have to blame me for that. Anyway, so we had a lovely time in Nepator, and we went around and met a lot of friends while we were there. Now, in the meantime, I should have mentioned, there were several Tamil conferences. The first one was Walaha Tamil Mahanadi. The first one was in KL, Kuala Lumpur, 66. The second one was in Chennai in 68. The third one was in Paris in 1970. And the fourth one that I went to was in Tanjavur. That was when Lalita was chief minister, so she had her alternative version going on in Tanjavur at the same time.
Yeah.
The official one. Anyway, on the second one it was, since you were asking about musicians, that was when I was introduced to Subbalakshmi, husband. They were, at that time, they were still living in West Madras, Teal Park, in those days, and I met her and oh dear, her husband, dreadful. See? He was a journalist, and also, of course, was her propagandist, if you like.
Yes.
Nice chap.
What was she like? Can you say something about what she was like as a person, Subbalakshmi?
What?
What was she like as a person?
Absolutely charming. Absolutely charming. I was invited, and so was Wendy on one occasion. By then, the time we really got to know them, they'd moved to a small house in Mambalam, T Nagar, where, of course, our flat had been in Madras, just round the corner from there. I think Tank Road in Nungambakkam. And we went there several times. David, their house was like a museum of modern Indian history. Pictures of people that were there. People like Tito, Bulganin, Khrushchev, you name it. Jimmy Carter, I think he was there. All sorts of figures. And their signed photographs were displayed in MS's household. No, she was delightful.
You know, John, I would like to ask you, if you agree, to speak a bit about the Thailand Tamil manuscripts.
You must be a thought reader, because my eye had just fell on the Tamil texts. Now, as with so much in my life, David, that was happenstance. S. Singaravelu, who was professor of Tamil in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia University, he had these recordings, and he lent them to me because he couldn't make out what they were. And the reason for me, I forget whether I had prompted him to lend them to me, but the fact is that in the 30s, excuse me just a moment, in the 30s, there was a chap called Quaritch Wales who wrote a book called The Siamese State Ceremonies. And in the course of the book, he had narrated of how he met the so-called Brahmin priests of the royal temple connected with the royal ceremonies of coronation, beside the great swing, which isn't used anymore because it was so dangerous, in Bangkok. He met these people. Why did I say so-called Brahmins? Because when I went there, they were A, wearing shoes in their temple, and B, smoking. So they didn't really come up to scratch. Anyway, Quaritch Wales had met these people and asked about their chants. And he said, what language are they in? And the answer was, well, we don't know what the language, of course we don't know it or understand it. It's a language for talking to God. Now, you can understand with sort of what we call Chinese whisper style, that after many centuries, whatever the original text was, in whatever language, it would have got, shall we say, corrupted. And my goodness, that was the case with these. And these chants, eventually I borrowed the recording that Singaravelu had, and David, by sheer good fortune, penny dropped. Now, how did it drop? I must tell you. Every so often, in these gibberish, dare I use that word, I'm sorry, there would be, in Thai accent, Jilita Chittamalam. And Chittamalam did it. I thought, this has to be Tiruchitrambalam, bearing in mind the phonology of Thai, and it's not even of the same family of languages as either, Indo-Aryan languages in India, or let alone
Dravidian.
Tamil, Dravidian language. And so, of course, it was Tiruchitrambalam, and that did it. I knew then, by the sheer good fortune, and why Singaravelu hadn't spotted it as a Tamilian himself, God alone knows. But I was lucky, it's because I'd done some Tevaram, in connection with my degree and other things with Thompson. And so, over the next 18 months, if only dear Wendy were here, because I commandeered the kitchen table for this enterprise, I had to transcribe the entire lot into intelligible Romanization, and incidentally solve the script, which seems to be a special invention for the purpose. The nearest I could relate to it would be Cambodian. But it is a Grunt, I called it Grunter script because it's clearly of Grunter origins. And in fact, one of the manuscripts, now that brings me to another strand, one of the manuscripts in the Vajrayana National Library in Bangkok, which I got to be able to study and photograph, has got a syllabary of the whole script. And so after that, it became dead easy. I could read it quite easily with the aid of the crib. And so that's what happened. In due course, SOAS Bulletin, give them their due. They did publish it. There were a lot of grumbles about exceeding the budget and so on, because they had to cut a number of new characters for their Tamil fount, which didn't exist, namely Gruntaksharam, and some extra Gruntaksharam to boot, which Tamil doesn't even use, like Ba and Ta, the aspirates, in other words, that lot. And so I went to their foundry. This was interesting, in Hertfordshire, to see how they produce type characters, the actual lead type itself, using a reducing pantograph to do it. And so I designed the characters for them, and they then reduced them. I went up. No, it was fascinating, David. It was worth it for quite other reasons. And eventually it was published in two bits, first in the SOAS Bulletin in 1969, and
Yes.
secondly, Journal of the Siam Society
Right.
in 1972. The division being more or less between the Tamil texts and the Sanskrit ones. The Sanskrit ones in part two, the Thai bit, the Bangkok bit, included Digbandhana binding the 8 cardinal points so that they're not nasty to you. It's
Yes.
a particular incantation in Sanskrit. The Tamil texts didn't take much chasing up since I'd located them as Tevaram, and interestingly, they turned out to be the first padigam of each of the Tevaram mover, the hymnists.
I see.
Tirunyana Sambandha, Appar and Sundara, your friend. The fourth lot was Monica Vasika's Tiruvasikam. And so it was a sort of resume, you could say, of the output of Tevaram.
Do you have any idea when they began? Do you know when they began to use these?
Sorry?
Do you have any idea when they began to use these in a liturgical way?
I wish I could suggest. Okay, I mean, if you want me to stick my head out, sometime between the 11th and 14th centuries.
Yeah, very early.
So very early in one sense, and plenty of time for it to get so corrupted in the mouths of people speaking a tonal Tibeto-Burman language.
Right.
And so, it was something I really enjoyed doing. But unfortunately, you see, this was one of my many problems at SOAS. Why don't you keep publishing? What about? What am I to publish? Debates about some point of Tamil linguistics or Tamil authorship or this, that, and the other. In other words, debating in print with colleagues. Now, David, this was not my forte. Put it down if you like to be an only child or whatever you like to put it down. I remember talking about this once with Kamil Zvelibil, which of course who was a great Czech Tamil scholar. And I discussed, he said, your trouble is you only want the cream of research. I said, look, I would put it another way. When I feel that something is worth talking about, I will do it. And the Thai manuscripts was one, and the other one that you kindly reminded me of was the Saiva saints, the Arubatu Mover.
At Darasaram.
In the Darasaram Chola temple, which
Yes.
is the smallest of the three that happily now conjointly Darasaram, let me get this right, Tanjavur and Gangai Kondachorapuram are jointly a World Heritage Site.
Yes.
I'm glad to say. Darasaram in some ways is the most complete of all three of them, and Darasaram contained this frieze of saints. Where did I come across it first? The book published by the Archaeological Survey of India on Chola temples, written by Sivarama Murthy, whom, dare I say it, should not, with his background, have got muddled. There is a summary at the end, and clearly he doesn't know who some of them are at all. And a saint who does this and another saint who does that, but he doesn't put names to them.
Oh.
I thought there has to be a reason for this. And that's what got me interested in why somebody with that background should not have grasped at once how to identify them. So, of course, now this Absolutely, it's thanks to RK Swan and the Swan Tours. I got to go to Darussalam several times, much to the consternation of the tour managers at the time, who kept on losing me, because the last thing I wanted was to have a group yakking all around me when I was trying to sort out these 63. Now, as you, with your book behind you, will know, the whole story of the Arabatamura is embedded, if I can say, in the story of Sundara.
Yes, indeed.
It is intrinsic to it. And in fact, the whole cycle ends with several episodes connected with Sundara. Whoever rescued the baby from the crocodile, all that sort of thing.
Yes, yes.
Crossing the Kaveri and all that. Now, my first recourse, of course, was to the Archaeological Survey. And here, David, was the culprit. The Archaeological Survey had very logically scanned, I have to use a modern word, they scanned the sculptures from left to right. That's where they went wrong. They had forgotten about our rule of productionum. So you have to scan something. If it's on the on the actual wall of a sanctum, you have to scan it from right to left, because you keep the right shoulder towards the object of veneration.
Right.
Only if, as in the Shiva temple at Prambanan in Java, there, where there is a narrative sculpted on the outer wall, there you can do it left to right, no problem. But this one, the whole question of direction of scanning of what you could call literally a strip cartoon had to be from right to left.
Yes.
Where it's on the inner wall. Have I got it right myself? Yes, I have. Right to left. So this set of sculptures, just to make things more difficult, it's interspersed with groups of devotees. So, for example, the Brahmins living at Chidambaram,
Tilai Varandanar.
the first bunch. And then there were several other bunches, just to put you off step. One, I think, is about number 39 or around there. I forget them all now, but they finish up with these episodes of Sundara on, predictably, the north end of the whole series. And once I had sorted out, this again was a muddle which I wanted to resolve. And hopefully in my article in SOAS Bulletin, which again I think they grumbled about because I'd taken up so many photographs, I insisted on having illustrated. I said, there's no point having the thing if you don't illustrate it properly. My relations at SOAS were somewhat tricky, shall we say. I've mentioned a dear friend in our own department. 3 other friends whom I should mention would be John O'Kell, Burmese, who I think is still with us, Professor Lape Sayaji in Burmese, honorific. He was a dear friend, and also a chap who unfortunately literally died in office at SOAS, Peter B., who was a lecturer in Thai. Now, he was incredibly helpful when I went to Bangkok to photograph the manuscripts about which I talked. And they were dear friends at SOAS. But I think we better gloss over some of the other difficulties.
I was going to ask you to talk about the Bhavan a little bit and your years of teaching at the...
Bhavan?
Yes, the Bhavan.
This is, of course, the last episode in this rather tortuous story, which I'm sure you'll cut down to size as you require. Last year, I was at SOAS before retiring. It was 1991 to 2, when I attained 65. And I had come across the Bharatiya Vidyabhavan's London office already, run by somebody who became a dear friend, that is Sri Mato Krishnamurti, had been deputed by our headquarters in Mumbai. I will use R now because I am connected still as vice chairman with the Bhavan, although I can't do much because I'm not online, you see. I'm not a modern, in other words, I'm a dinosaur. Anyway, excuse me. They had sent Mataji, as we called him, to England in 1972, and he set us up in a small shop premises in New Oxford Street, number 37. And we were there for some years. And then in 1978, we eventually acquired our current premises in West Kensington, which is a disused church. It had been partly bombed during World War II. Excuse me. And we moved there. Harold Macmillan, I remember, was a guest of honour and significantly on the platform fell asleep. Politicians are like that. And he, Mataji, I mean, valiantly ran this organisation with his wife, late dear Lakshmi. Lakshmi and Mataji ran it on their own for some years. And we were nothing like the size that we are now, ostensibly with about 900 students. And we were, of course, when we were still operating physically as well as virtually, we were the largest Indian cultural centre outside India. And as I say, in my last year, I agreed, because I had a full-time job at that time, and it was full-time because I had about 40 students doing Indian art history. Indian art history gradually took over, and I was in fact posted to the archaeology department, so I was a member of 2 departments at the end. I wasn't paid 2 salaries, I may say, but I was a member of 2 departments, and I was really too busy. It seems unbelievable of me, but there we are. And in the last year, I agreed, we had a revered vocal teacher, Vidushi Shivashakti Shivanation. And she was our vocal and veena teacher, and she begged me to do the theory and history of Carnatic music. So I took that on. And frankly, David, for the last 30 years, excuse me, until lockdown in 2020, were the most enjoyable teaching years. Free of all this politics and manoeuvring, which so us, you as a student wouldn't have been aware of it.
Right.
Lucky you. And I'm afraid I used to insulate collectively you, students, among whom, apart from your honourable self, there was, of course, Nanda Kumara, who did his PhD. I was his supervisor. And also Sharada Srinivasan, who is now a senior colleague of Rajani's at National Institute of Advanced Studies.
I know.
Probably our leading archaeometallurgist, Sharada, with an impeccable science background. Her father was head of our Atomic Energy Authority.
She's done amazing work on the bronzes, the Chola bronzes. Amazing work.
Apart from yourselves, I had some very good undergraduate students as well, some of whom James remembers. We were talking about somebody called Peter Crotty coming along, Nivedita Mehta, she was another one. But I'm afraid I may have said it to you at some stage, but I certainly had to say it to several of them when they wanted to go to the administrative department on the first floor. What do you need there? Send me, ask me to go, because if you go, you'll get wrapped over the knuckles. And that is what used to happen. The registry and the office used to become absolutely appalling, especially to students. And so I'm afraid on more than one occasion I had to go down there and fight their battles for them, which I was perfectly prepared to do. But that's another story. But the Boven, you see, David, was completely free of all this. Now, the
Yes.
Boven brings me to the last bit of my story, and that is that in 2000, dear Mataji asked me, he said, look, you keep on going to India for swans, how about going to India for us? And so he asked me to go and lecture on both music and Indian art history at the Bhavan Centres in Bangalore, now Bengaluru, of course, Bangalore and Mysore. And that I did. And when I got to Bangalore the first evening, he introduced to me, she must have been about 2021, Rajani. This is Rajani. She will look after you while you're in Bangalore. Well, not only that, she insisted on coming down to Mysore with me, which she did. And eventually, her parents were quite keen. She wanted to come to England. So she came and lived with us as a tourist for 6 months. And we took her literally from one end of the country to the other. We went to the northern end, which of course is Dunnet Head. It is not John O'Groats, which the books might tell you, but geographically it's Dunnet Head, Dunnet, Head, to the west of John O'Groats. Then the other one, which is incontrovertible, namely Land's End, and the southern one, which again you might overlook, the Lizard. So there's extremities north, west and south of the mainland of Britain we took her to.
John, are you aware that Rajani is with us for this interview?
Yeah, well, Rajani, of course, has maintained contact with us ever since. She came back about 18 months later and did an MA at a campus of the officially University of Sussex, but actually at Farnham. And she had an international driving license, so she used to borrow one of our cars and drive herself there every day to Farnham. She got an MA there in art history, but while she was there with us, she again lived with us for 14 months then. And again, we made a point of taking her hither and thither. And one of the places we had taken her to was Bletchley Park. RAF Medmenham hadn't yet been open to the public when it is now, but these were centres of aerial scanning using 3D lens imagery and all the rest of it. And she got fascinated by this subject. And so I remember saying to her, Rajani, you realise the new bit of this is satellite technology. And she got herself interested in that, particularly when she went back to India. And of course, that's what she does. She's a professor of, I showed you the Elephant Boy book, and I perhaps should finish with showing you Rajani's book, published last autumn.
Yes.
You may have seen it.
You know, John, if you're not too tired, we could actually ask Rajani and Niharika and Sudha to join us now. Perhaps we could talk a little more informally for a few minutes. I'm going to have to go at 5:30 my time.
Can I say something you want about Vivaldi and Bhashanga ragas?
Do you want to say a few words about that? I'd be glad.
I would answer that quite briefly. I think the interest in, if you want to translate Vivaldi as discord, I can't stop you. And I think from the acoustic point of view, it is a modern interest to indulge these. But it's important to remember that the swaras of a Bhashanga raga are not necessarily Vivaldi at all.
Yes.
They don't belong to Vivaldi melas.
Right.
Vivaldi properly is applied to the mela. I checked up all the meanings of these the other day. And Vivaldi simply means that they don't conform to the ordinary rules, and it's applied to mela kartas where you want to, quote unquote, cheat and have 2 seconds. So let me see if I can still do it. Sa re ga ma pa da ni sa di da pa ma ga re sa. Well, that's Kanakongi, the first mela, which is a Vivaldi mela, and the 72nd, which is the last of the whole bunch. Sa re ga ma pa da ni sa di da pa ma ga re sa. Arusea veno maya, arane murugaya, arusea veno maya, arane murugaya, arusea veno maya, and so on. All the notes, as it were, are like froth, which has gradually risen to the surface. And this Mela-Carta system, in my view, is unequaled as a scalar classification. The book, since you wrote about it to me in your questions, the book I recommend, if you don't know it already, is Sangraha Chudamani.
Yes.
If you get hold of that one, that has, in my view, the most exhaustive explanation for all the significance of all 72 melas. I mean, if you haven't got it, somehow or other, if I can get it copied or printed, my notes on them, because I've been right through the whole thing when I was still teaching at the Boven. But the Mela-Carta system involves, therefore, Vivaldi melas. Now, your other point was Bhashanga swaras. Now, Bhashanga, as far as I can make out, if it means anything, the word Pasha, and it's Pasha, by the way, BH, not P. I spotted the P in your question.
I'll tell you why I did that in a moment.
I know, because you're a Tamil scholar. You may have found a meaning for Pasha with a P.
You don't think it could be from Pashanda, Pashanga, that is an alien or a heretical note?
Oh, right, okay. But Bhasha itself can mean vernacular or colloquial. Yes. Now, my point is that so many of the Bhashanga ragas can be, if you like, bracketed with what we call Deshya ragas, because they employ more than one pitch for a particular odd note. You mentioned Ananda Bhairavi.
Yes.
An easy, straightforward one is Bhairavi. Sagariga ma padani sa. Chatusriti da going up and regulate Sani the Permagari. In Balagopala Anupallavi. Hold on. Upaveshadhara Murali Gopaveshadhara Muralidhara Sridhara Damodara Varavaya, and so on. 2 das, but always in a regular positioning. You can't do them just anywhere. And this is why I still think Fox Strangway's term melody mould isn't bad. Trouble is, mould has another meaning in English. And so I preferred, when I was teaching, melodic pattern or melodic sequence. I preferred melodic pattern because, of course, that takes care of the ones that are not, unlike Bhairavi, sequential.
Yes. Thank you. That's a beautiful statement.
Probably enough, David, for one session.
So, John, before we ask Rajani to come on, maybe I'll just say a couple of words. We'll have to bring the interview as such, I guess, to an end. But I want to thank you for many things, not just for this interview. It was my great adrishtam, my tremendous blessing, that I found my way to you as my teacher. You should know you have
Thank
you've
you.
had an immense impact on my life, and it's wonderful to see you looking well. I want to thank you for this interview.